The Young and the Restless spoilers Wednesday full episodes July 9, 2025. Even as the city stood paralyzed by Amanda's personal tragedy, elsewhere in Genoa City, another wave of heartbreak unfurled its grip, this time wrapping its cold fingers around the very heart of Victoria. The news of Cole's death hit her like a silent bomb, not in the loud, explosive way grief often presents, but in the way it quietly severs a lifeline from within. She had tried calling her parents, dialing her mother's number over and over again, only to be met with a ringing line that felt like an endless void. Victor was unreachable, as always, his whereabouts carefully shielded behind layers of control and obligation. Nikki, too, was absent either by circumstance or choice, and so Victoria was left alone, drifting in the black ocean of loss with no anchor, no compass. That is, until she ran into Nate. The man who once stood as both colleague and betrayer had re-entered her orbit not with arrogance or expectation, but with a quiet willingness to listen. At first, she resisted. Pride had always been her armor. But in the echo chamber of her grief, his presence was less an intrusion and more a balm. When she finally let herself lean into his shoulder, for just 1 minute, the pressure of holding herself together began to crack, and the tears came unapologetic and pure. Across town, her daughter Claire was undergoing her own unraveling. The loss of Cole wasn't just emotional, it was existential. He had been her anchor to a world she had only recently begun to accept. Now, with his voice silenced forever, she had no one to turn to, at least not anyone she could reach. Kyle was absent. His phone rang endlessly, and Claire couldn't shake the growing feeling that something was keeping him away, something unspoken. But just when the silence threatened to consume her completely, there was Holden. He had appeared in the most unexpected of moments recently, during her panic attack, during the breakdown she hadn't wanted anyone to witness. And now, in the stillness of her mourning, he sat beside her once again. He didn't try to fix her grief. He simply stayed. And that simple act of presence became a kind of rescue. For the first time since Cole's death, Claire allowed herself to breathe. Meanwhile, in a different corner of Genoa City, Danny Romalotti was planning something that, under any other circumstance, would have lit up the city's rumor mill like wildfire. But tonight wasn't about the press or the glamour or the eyes of curious onlookers. It was about Christine. After years of diverging paths, of what-ifs and unfinished sentences, Danny had made a decision: he was going to propose. He had booked the entire restaurant, arranged for a pianist to play their song, and spent hours rehearsing the words he wanted to say. But when the moment came, when he knelt on one knee and looked up into Christine's eyes, all those rehearsed lines melted away. What poured out instead was real, raw, and completely unscripted. It was the kind of vulnerability he hadn't shown in years. The question hung in the air between them. Not just will you marry me, but do we still believe in who we were, and what we can be now? The entire city seemed to hold its breath for Christine's answer. Back in Amanda's world, as chance expanded the investigation, Victoria's sorrow quietly fused with Amanda's anxiety in the city's emotional atmosphere. Chance began cross-referencing Amanda's timeline with a network of known associates, and the deeper he dug, the more disturbing the picture became. While no one could confirm the child's current location, someone had wiped digital traces from Amanda's home network, suggesting premeditation. Whoever took the child didn't act on impulse, they had planned for this, timed it precisely after Devon's discovery. That raised terrifying possibilities. Was this an inside job? A message? Or worse, the beginning of something larger? Victoria, though grieving, found herself drawn to Amanda's story. She too had once fought for her children, had once feared losing them to forces she couldn't control. She understood the panic, the helplessness. And in a moment of quiet resolve, she offered to speak to Victor, to urge him, if he could be reached, to leverage his resources to help locate Amanda's daughter. It was the first act of purpose Victoria had found since Cole's death. As for Claire, her connection to Holden was beginning to shift. What had started as reluctant gratitude for his concern had evolved into something deeper, complicated by proximity, pain, and unspoken things. He held her hand in silence as she lit a candle for her father, and when she broke down in the hallway of Memorial, it was Holden who caught her. Not Kyle. Not her grandfather. Holden. The irony wasn't lost on her. In a world where trust was transactional and love rarely came without conditions, Holden asked for nothing, only to be allowed to care. Amanda, meanwhile, began reviewing every conversation, every strange look she'd received in recent weeks. And in doing so, she remembered something she hadn't thought of before, a seemingly innocent comment Kane made 2 nights before the disappearance. "Children are unpredictable," he had said, almost absently, especially when they're not really yours. At the time, it had seemed like a philosophical aside. But now, replaying his tone, the weight behind his words chilled her. She handed the memory over to Chance, who added it to the growing file. Devon, too, began his own search, separate from the police, unwilling to sit idle. He pulled every favor, called in private investigators, and even considered reaching out to some of his more questionable past contacts. For him, this wasn't just about redemption, it was about reclaiming a future he'd been robbed of. And in the darkest hours of the night, he found himself standing outside Amanda's door, not for answers, but to make a silent promise. No matter who took their daughter, no matter the reason, he would find her. And as the city of Genoa held its breath between love and loss, between hope and devastation, 3 women, Amanda, Victoria, and Claire, each faced the unraveling of their lives from different corners of the same storm. Amanda's child had vanished into the night. Victoria's partner had been stolen by death. Claire's sense of stability had crumbled in her hands. But what connected them wasn't just tragedy, it was resilience. And the battle to reclaim what they'd lost was only just beginning. While Amanda, Victoria, and Claire navigated their own storms of grief, fear, and longing, Genoa City's undercurrents continued to shift with a different kind of intensity, strategic, seductive, and potentially catastrophic. In the shadows of emotional chaos, Adam had returned to town, not with noise or fanfare, but with quiet calculation. His visit to Genoa City wasn't announced to the press, nor did he notify Victor or Nick. Instead, he went straight to Chelsea. Their past was complicated, laced with betrayal and pain, but beneath it all still smoldered a mutual understanding, a knowledge that when united, they were capable of toppling giants. Chelsea welcomed him with guarded curiosity, unsure if he had come to make peace or start a war. But when Adam laid out his plan, a restructuring of power that would weaken both Newman Enterprises and Chancellor Winters, she listened, intrigued. They spoke in code, in half-finished sentences and glances that held more weight than words. Their alliance would not be public. It would live in whispers and back channels, but it would change everything. At the same time, Lily, still reeling from the emotional tightrope she had been forced to walk with both Devon and Amanda's secrets, began to notice the cracks forming around Damien Kane. What had once seemed like a polished facade now revealed small fissures. His control was slipping, his charm now shadowed by arrogance, and Lily began to rethink their dynamic. Damien had once made her feel powerful. Now he made her feel watched. She understood he wanted control over the fragrance division, that his influence had already reached too far. But Lily was a Winters, resilient, strategic, and never one to cede territory without a fight. She contacted Nick and Sharon, proposing a meeting not just to discuss business, but to form a counterbalance. Nick agreed, sensing that Phyllis and Audra were no longer the only ones playing high-stakes games. Sharon, always the empath, saw in Lily's expression something more urgent than numbers and quarterly goals. She saw the flicker of fear behind Lily's ambition. Back in the romantic haze of France, the game was playing out very differently. Audra, ever the master of timing, had planned every beat of her seduction with mathematical precision. She drifted across the suite in barely their silk, the air scented with a floral amber blend she knew Kyle would remember. Kyle, amused and not entirely resistant, watched her with a mixture of intrigue and calculation. He was not immune to Audra's allure. She was intelligent, bold, unapologetically sensual. But she was also dangerous, especially now, when the boundaries between business strategy and personal temptation had blurred. When Audra leaned in to discuss the upcoming perfume campaign at the luxury restaurant they were scheduled to attend, she smiled with satisfaction as she noticed Kyle's focus beginning to slip. But as they entered the candlelit terrace, any semblance of flirtation evaporated. Across the room, seated beneath an arch of imported roses, were Lily and Damien. The tension was instant. Damien's eyes narrowed. Lily straightened in her seat. Kyle hesitated. Audra simply smiled, recognizing the battlefield for what it was. The air in the restaurant grew dense with unspoken accusations and veiled hostility. Every glance became a weapon. Kyle, trying to recover, suggested returning to Audra's suite to refine their marketing strategy. Audra agreed with a smirk, her voice laced with double meaning. "There's something intoxicating about France," she whispered once they were alone again. "No wonder the world's most dangerous perfumes are born here." Kyle laughed, but the unease in his eyes betrayed his inner conflict. He told her she was getting him to agree too easily, that she was starting to push past his guard. Audra leaned closer and murmured, "Then you'd better catch up." Whether she was talking about perfume or seduction, Kyle wasn't sure anymore. And in that uncertainty, she held all the power. Meanwhile, back in Genoa City, Danny Romalotti's proposal to Christine had set off a chain reaction. Though her answer hadn't yet been made public, whispers had already begun to circulate. If she said yes, it would mark a long-awaited union. If she declined, it could unravel Danny's quiet rebranding as a man finally ready for stability. Even Phyllis, who had once been a thorn in their side, seemed to be unusually silent, a silence that felt less like peace and more like plotting. Amanda, still chasing every clue about her missing daughter, received a strange envelope under her door with no return address. Inside was a photograph, blurry but unmistakable. Her daughter, seated in a chair next to a figure whose face had been blacked out. On the back, scribbled in red ink, were the words, "You shouldn't have told him." Her breath caught in her throat. This wasn't just about custody. This was personal. Someone was sending her a message. And whoever it was, they were watching. Adam, meanwhile, met Chelsea in the back of the underground, where he revealed something she hadn't expected. He suspected that Victor's surveillance had been tampered with. If Victor no longer had eyes on his enemies, then the power balance had shifted irreversibly. Chelsea raised a brow. "Then we move now," she said. "Before he rebuilds his fortress." Adam nodded. "This time, we hit him where it hurts. Not his money. His loyalty network. We turn his allies against him." And somewhere, beneath the glittering lights of a high-end restaurant in France, Kyle Abbott made the worst decision of his life, not with words, but with silence. He didn't stop Audra when she stepped closer. He didn't stop her when her lips brushed against his. And in that moment, Claire Newman, still grieving, still clinging to Holden, was erased from his conscience, if only temporarily. Tomorrow, he would regret it. But tonight, temptation won. Far from the candlelit tension of France and the emotional wreckage Amanda and Claire were drowning in, a different kind of confrontation was brewing, one buried deep within a maze of secrets, quite literally. Nick had led Phyllis through the private hedged labyrinth outside the estate in Nice, insisting on privacy, on a place where no phone could overhear and no servant could interrupt. The hedges were overgrown, ancient, twisting. A perfect metaphor for the tangled mess they were both navigating. Phyllis, draped in a bold red silk wrap and heels far too impractical for uneven gravel, followed him with half amusement and half suspicion. But the moment Nick stopped at the quiet center of the maze and turned to face her, the gravity in his expression made her straighten. This wasn't about flirtation or unresolved tension. This was war talk. Nick didn't ease into it. His voice was low, sharp, and deliberate as he told her what he'd discovered. Kane had been quietly purchasing large stakes in multiple businesses across Genoa City under shell companies, funneling money through European accounts and consolidating more power than anyone had realized. And while the entire cast of movers and shakers had been conveniently lured to Nice, distracted by elegance, perfumes, and emotional manipulation, Kane had already returned to Genoa City. Alone. Unnoticed. Unchallenged. While we're here sipping rose, Nick growled, he's building a fortress back home. And no one sees it. Phyllis blinked, pretending to be surprised. Kane's always been like Houdini, she quipped with a forced smirk. Escaping from straitjackets, locked rooms, and terrible reputations. But even her sarcasm couldn't cover the flicker in her eyes. Nick saw it, and he knew her too well. Don't do that, he snapped, stepping forward and grabbing her wrist. Don't pretend you didn't know. Don't play dumb with me. She tried to pull away, but he held on, not forcefully, but firmly. This isn't just a business deal anymore. This is a power shift. Kane's playing a game with stakes higher than you've seen before. And he's using everyone, Amanda, Chelsea, Damien, even you, like pawns on a board. Phyllis scoffed, but it was a hollow sound. Nick's eyes narrowed. You need to decide. Now. Are you on his side, or ours? That question hung between them like a blade. Phyllis didn't answer right away. She looked around the maze, suddenly aware of how isolated they were. Kane had made her promises, partnership, influence, a seat at the table. But Nick was offering something else entirely, the truth. A bitter, risky truth that could blow everything up. She hated him for putting her in this position, and hated herself more for not knowing what she truly wanted. You're asking me to bet against someone who's already 4 moves ahead, she whispered. Nick stepped closer. Then it's time we caught up. Unbeknownst to them, Adam had already left France. Victor had called him back, not with orders, but with a quiet challenge: prove your loyalty to the family or stay in exile. Adam, always dancing between redemption and rebellion, chose to return. Not for Victor, but for himself. Chelsea had planted a seed in his mind. About reshaping the battlefield, targeting Newman's soft underbelly. But now, with Kane moving pieces in the dark and Victor losing control over his inner circle, Adam knew the real war wasn't between Newman and Chancellor. It was between old power and rising insurgents. He wasn't just going back to Genoa City to follow orders. He was going to exploit the vacuum Kane had created. Back in the maze, Phyllis finally pulled her wrist free. I'm not a pawn, she said bitterly. I make my own rules. Nick didn't flinch. Then choose your rulebook wisely. Because the next time we're in this maze, it won't be for a conversation, it'll be to dig someone's grave.